it's awesome to look at one of the more specific topics that Vernon can help you manage within the system. So in this case, a specialist collection type, and looking at the features that Vernon has to help you manage that particular collection. So we'll be looking in detail today at natural history collections and the fields and functions in the system that support that. A lot of the fields that you use are ones that are just generically useful for any kind of collection. So it would be typical, for instance, to be assigning a department to group together certain natural history specimens, and that might even have sub-departments. So you might have a natural history or natural sciences term, and then terms underneath that for more specific areas like entomology for insects, geology, land mammals, and so on. Whatever categories make sense in terms of how you're wanting to drill down into those collections, and then often that's reflecting who's managing that within your institution. So those terms can be very specific if you do have individuals that are responsible for those smaller subsets. On the first screen, we're looking at the object identification screen. One of the key fields is the classification field. And so that's really important for natural science collections so that you can accurately assign what kind of thing this is and create whole hierarchies to organize those different things. So that might be different categories of minerals breaking down into subtypes. Or in my example, I'm looking at a bee fly specimen, and we're linking to a classification in the Linnaean natural science structure. And so each of those classifications is just using the generic classification file in Vernon, the same as social history would be classifying furnishings, furniture, wardrobes. Here instead we have a whole hierarchy of terms going down from the broadest areas. So this is a type of animal, it's an arthropod, and so on. So we'll be looking at that in more detail today. Secondly, we also manage where this thing came from. So for social history collections, often objects have been donated or purchased from somebody, but natural history collections, in many cases, you've actually collected that from out in the field. So the field collection page helps you summarize all of that information. Who collected it, how did they collect it, and where did they collect it from? The physical aspects page is used for any type of collection item, but it has a number of different fields that are relevant to natural history collections. So that can include things like the colour that's present in that particular specimen, the sex. For instance, if you had a mammal specimen, you might describe the sex of that specimen, and you might describe the age. For each of those fields, you can describe term fields that group them into key categories, and then you can put more specific information in the description field that's beside that. And then you may have things within the natural science collection where it's things like models. And so models, you've also got things like the scale field to describe attributes of a scale of a model that got made of a specimen. If you had a geology collection, the same page can be used to describe things like the shape and the surface of the item, and that can be important for ascribing attributes to mineral collections. As well as the field collection page, we can also describe more detail about the particular sites that you went to collect those specimens. And that can be important for when you're going and collecting a large number of specimens in one single visit. So for instance, with insect collections, a collector might go out and use a net and catch 100 different moths in one single catch at a particular place. The site file in Vernon is used to describe the details of that particular location. And so we can see the site file then summarizes the detail of where that place is and different information about that. Then lastly, when we store this item within our collection, we might want to note things that are specific to the natural science collections and how their storage is managed. And so that's on the location page. We can switch to the storage tab, and storage method is a field that's often used to then describe perhaps it's wet storage, and you might describe in some of the other storage requirement fields the proportion of ethanol that's in that specimen, for example. So that's a quick overview of the fields that are available, and we'll go into a bit more detail on some of those. So far, we've just been looking at the generic screens within Vernon. So the identification screen is designed to handle any kind of collection item, but we can build custom screens to suit the needs of a particular collection. That's something that most of our largest natural science collection sites have made use of. So people like Auckland Museum and Queensland Museum have custom natural science screens, and they pull in the fields that they're most using from the different pages we've looked at so far, and they present those on a single cataloguing screen. Our demo system has an example of that. So this biodiversity screen at the top isn't a generic screen in the system, but it's an example of how a custom screen might look. And so this screen's taking fields that are freely available in other parts of the system already, but instead of you jumping between several different screens to access those, we can now view them on this one single multi-tab window. And so we can see, for instance, the specimen category field. We can see age and sex, which we saw before on the physical aspects window. Classification's been moved to the first page because that's one of the most important pieces of information. And then we've got other details like the most important field collection details, some background about what place it came from, and then sundry details, other numbers that have been assigned to it, related objects. Related object is used for natural science collections for things like where you've got two specimens that are directly connected. An example would be that in botany collections, you may collect a parasitic plant and the host plant, and you could describe that both of those were linked together and that maybe this particular fern was a parasite on a larger tree, and you've collected a sample of each of those. And so those custom screens have to be created at our end, and that's something we work together with you to figure out what's the layout that makes sense, what are the fields that you're wanting to include, and if there's any label changes. So there's a bit of development work at our end to make those custom screens work, and that's chargeable work from our side. So typically it takes a day and a half for us to develop a new custom screen for a specific client. And then that becomes part of Vernon's generic code base, and it's maintained as we move versions forward. So that's the custom screen. I'll now look at the classification field in a bit more detail. So we saw that this particular bee fly is this genus and species. It's a Thraxon abditus, and those particular phrases are part of the hierarchy of the classification for this term. In this case, that's very specific information. We've got the genus and the species, which would often be the lowest level that you're classifying things as, but that naturally fits into a whole hierarchy, which we can also create in Vernon. And that means every time you've got another genus to add to that section, you've already got that whole hierarchy to plug into. So if I click on the classification field, I can use the Go To button at the top to jump to the related record for that classification. And so that's going to take me to the record for that particular species, and that species will in turn link up to the genus, then up to the family, and onwards through the whole hierarchy of the Linnaean system. We can use the long name form for common names, and that means that that's something that would be searchable whenever you're searching on classifications. So you could search for kiwi, and if that had been recorded as a common name for Apteryx australis, which is the genus and species of the kiwi bird, then you'd be able to find it under that common name as well. We can record information that's specific to that particular species in general, or indeed to any level within that classification structure. So we can see, for instance, that this particular species was first identified by the scientists Yates and Lamkin in 1998. And that field's using another authority term field so that you can standardize the formatting and the punctuation of that citation and then reuse that citation in other species that they might have also identified. You might go into more detail and actually record what was the document where that species was first published and described in. and perhaps the page number that it appeared in. There might be other references too that you want to include, other research articles about that particular species, and they can be documented at this level rather than on each individual object record where you would be duplicating that information. There's also further information where we can describe some notes about that species and particular attributes about it. If I bring up the example of Apteryx australis, which is the kiwi bird. So there's Apteryx australis there. In fact, it has a number of subspecies, of which we've documented one in our demo system. So we can see the same information. We've recorded a common name of brown kiwi, and we've recorded some general attributes. So those attribute fields on this page are relatively free form. You can create any categories you want to track on that, and you do that just by creating a term for this column. So I've got habitat as an example of an environmental attribute, and then you use the notes column to then put other details about that. In our demo system, I'd recorded conservation status here, but we have actually since added a dedicated field for conservation status. And then we can also have geographic origin, saying where is that particular species found, with any notes that you want to record about that. Lastly, on the thesaurus tab, that's the general functions that you have anywhere in Vernon for creating these hierarchies and relationships between terms. And so that's where we can see that whole stack of terms going all the way up. So all of birds fit under aves, birds are vertebrates, they fit under chordata, which is animals with a central nervous system, and so on, all the way up to the top. And so by recording that in one place, it means any other specimens that we have that relate to that same species classification record have that additional information available. Now, that's something we can make use of in the reporting in Vernon by creating symbolic or calculated fields to pull in that information into the object records. So we saw, for instance, that this particular species had a whole hierarchy of family, classification, order, and so on. You may want to reference those higher levels from a report that you're doing about objects. If I go into List Manager, in our demo system, we have in fact already created symbolic or calculated fields that can access that detail. So the fact that this particular specimen is from Insecta, the insect group, isn't something we can see normally directly on the object file, but it's part of that classification hierarchy. And so I've created a calculated field that can pull that information in, and then in List Manager and reporting, I can access that. And for many of our clients, that would be information that they might then later publish to other places, a Vernon Browser online collection site, or a third-party natural history website that's aggregating content, perhaps from many different organizations. Those classifications may change over time as well. So Vernon includes fields for keeping a history of classifications for a particular specimen. So later on, somebody might revisit that specimen, study it, and realize that it's been misclassified, or perhaps at a higher level, it's been identified that that species isn't actually a unique species. It's just a variation of one that was already separately published under another name. And so in that second case, we can actually search for all the examples we have of the misclassification, and we can do a bulk update of the classification field. So I'll just show an example of that. We access that through the Tools menu, and under Bulk Classification Update, we first say what are the objects that we're wanting to change, and I can do that either by a search in that field or by accessing a list I might have prepared earlier. So 2 of those bee flies have been classified as this particular species name. That species name I've decided is actually incorrect. It's a species name which shouldn't be used again in the future. So I could select all of those specimens, and we might have hundreds of those. And then I can put in the details of the new classification. So I've got a slightly different version of that classification under the same genus. That one there. So at the moment it's marked as a candidate new term in Vernon, and we can later approve that. I can say who's classified it. So let's just say that I reclassified it, and I'll use T for today. And then we can decide what we're doing with the classification entry that's already in there. So we might be just adding a second classification in there because for some reason both are valid, but more likely we would use one of these other options to say maybe we're moving all of the current entries from the classification table into the history because all of that is older, incorrect information. We can then say, why are we reclassifying this? And you can create your own terms for keeping track of that. So we could say that that was a nominal revision. So there's some restructuring of the naming within the Linnaean hierarchies, and we're having to revise the names as a result of that. And then I can do OK to bulk update that. And so that's completed now. So what we'll do is we'll jump across to one of those specimens, and we'll just see how that affected the cataloguing on that specimen. And so there's the two new ones. And so they've got that new classification that we've added. The old classification is available on the classification history page. So if I click on that, we'll be able to see the past information under that table. And that's a history that just can build up over time if you did further nominal revisions of the name at some point in the future. So that's an example of renaming a particular specimen. Now I'm going to dig into the field collection information in a little bit more detail. So whenever you go out into the field to collect specimens, you can assign a unique number to that collection event. You might say, well, this is the kind of unique number for the day and the place where we went and gathered a whole bunch of different things. And you may end up having dozens or hundreds of specimens that were collected as part of that. So that field collection reference number can be important for tracking the kind of grouping of that set of material that you got. Many of the fields are authority fields, so you can create terms to create consistent keywords for different things like the method by which you acquired it and things like the specimen category. Here we can see that this particular bee fly, as well as the original specimen, there's also a DNA tissue sample that's been made. So in the case of Queensland Museum, where this example's come from, they've got a DNA tissue sample database where they've got freezers for storing that material, and they number those separately. So a DNA tissue sample's been made, the notes in the count field has been used to describe the number that was assigned to that DNA tissue sample and where that sample came from. We can see that in the place section that it's linking to a field collection site. So for this particular insect, it was part of a whole group gathering of specimens, and there is a related site record that describes that particular collection event. And so once only the details of where that place was, what the map coordinates are, the details of any numbers that were assigned to it, who worked there, all of that kind of material has been entered once, and then it's been linked to many different collection items after that. So that's a process which is most commonly seen in entomology collections because you tend to be gathering a large number of specimens at the same time. In contrast, for instance, for a mammal collection, that wouldn't be the standard approach because you're generally collecting just one single example of a kiwi, for instance, or a mammal. If you went out and collected just one leopard, you just describe all of that directly on the object record. There are further details that we could record, including what access there was to the particular site. And then on the left-hand side, there are submenus as well, particularly for geology. So if you had geological science collections, you can describe a whole lot of attributes about the geology of that location, as opposed to just the one single specimen. So you may have collected a calcite specimen from a particular cave. This site record can describe the attributes of that cave as opposed to the one single specimen that got described in the object record. So that's the related site record. We can also make use of the document references page. And that can be used to link to other publications that cite this particular specimen. And it can link to third-party resources that are on the web. So you can just paste web URLs here, and then they would be clickable to open up that resource. And so you can also do that in other files in Vernon, like the species record in the classification file. We've got a whole lot of detail of specimens now. We might want to get some of that information out of Vernon. So I'll show you a couple of different examples of people doing that. I've created a pre-saved report template that lets me take this information out and send it to Google Maps. So we could see in the example that I had latitude, longitude information recorded for those specimens, and I could export that now to Google Maps. So I'm going to run a report on those. And if I look at my Open Report Template button, we can see that I've already made an XML export format. So Google Earth and Google Maps use a standard XML format, which Vernon supports. And that XML format's very specific. It requires a certain number of fields, each of which have to be formatted in a certain way. So if I look at that saved report, it's got a calculated field that is going to basically be the title on each pin on the map. It's got a description field. It's got a link to the image, and then it has the latitude and longitude point. And those are the key 5 pieces of information that Google Maps and Google Earth needs. In the formatting options of that report, we have where this data is going to go. So I'm sending it to my C drive to a temporary file, and I'm calling that KML, which is the XML standard that Vernon is writing the information out to. It's called Keyhole Markup Language, which is a language for describing locations on maps. So that's all I need to do to run that. I've already got everything else in place. So let's export all of those records. I can now swap to Google Maps and open up that file. So when you're in Google Maps, there's a menu at the top left, and from that menu, provided you're signed into Google, you'll have a section for your places, is what it calls any kind of custom map that you've made. So I can go to your places, and I can go to maps, and we can see a whole bunch of different ones that I've imported in the past, but I can also create a new map. And that's the point where it'll say, well, what's the file where all of this data is recorded? And so I can say that I'm going to import a set of data. And that's where I'm going to be selecting that file that I just created on the C drive. I could rename the title of the map and that particular layer so that it had something more meaningful, but that's already enough. And so we can see all of those specimens from Vernon getting exported, and they're just appearing as pins that I can zoom down into. So there's a whole bunch of specimens down from the South Island, and I can click on any one of those to bring up the further details. I think most of them haven't got descriptions. So that's kind of the basics of pulling out those details across to something like Google Maps. On a more complex level, all of the data that's in Vernon can be exported in a range of different formats for use in other systems. Queensland Museum have used that process to publish to Vernon browser, and from there that data is harvested into the national aggregation site that's called the Atlas of Living Australia. So that's an aggregation site which currently takes information from over 10,000 different data sets. And so Queensland Museum is just one of those many data sets. And so this is the homepage for Queensland Museum's content on that shared website. So we can see here that we've got 800,000 records. And so every one of those records is a record which is back in Vernon, and that's been published to a copy of Vernon browser. And then every few days, Atlas of Living Australia is requesting the latest information from the browser site. And so if I scroll down that page, I've already zoomed into a part of the map. So we can see Auckland there, we can see the coast there. And like we had on Google Maps before, each of those is a specimen record. So on their site, everyone says, well, what's the source data set, some basic information about it, and a link to view the record within this website. And so that takes us to a page that describes all the details about that particular item. Here we can see those different levels of the classification structure as we saw back in Vernon earlier. And so again, that's making use of those calculated fields to pull out each of those levels as something we can separately report on and display in a specific way anywhere else further down the line. And so we've got a whole long set of record data plus some generic data that this site is generating about that location.